Hello and welcome. My name's Randall English. I am currently president of the board of directors of the Newport Bay Conservancy, and I'm also a naturalist for the Newport Bay Conservancy. I'm here to say welcome and thank you for taking part in NBC's naturalist training. If our volunteers are the glue that hold this organization together, the naturalists are the super glue. Taking a lead position, supporting our mission of protecting and preserving the Upper Newport Bay and its watershed through education, restoration, research, and advocacy. The knowledge gained here will be passed along to the public when leading tours and hikes, answering questions at the Muth front desk, or hosting Back Science Sundays at the Back Bay Science Center. The knowledge will also be very valuable in leading other volunteers in restoration projects and litter cleanups. It will give you skills to assist in bird counts, insect surveys, fish counts, and all of these activities together are all supporting that core mission and preserving and protecting the bay. I'll also say not only does the knowledge gained give you that ability, making you a more valuable volunteer, it also will enhance your enjoyment. I might be a nerd, but I find it really fun to be able to identify organisms, not just by their markings, but by their behaviors or other characteristics. To understand the relationships between those organisms and the environments they exist in. And that really leads us to tonight's session. The environment and the ecology of the Upper Newport Bay. Thank you for taking part in this course. It's new to us doing this electronically, or mostly electronically, aside from labs. One thing I learned when I took the course is the community of my students together helped us all learn and make the information more valuable. And that's carried through into our volunteering together in these activities I had already mentioned. But we have a lot tonight. Again, welcome. Thank you for joining us. Enjoy.
Thank you, Randall. Hello, everyone. My name is Hillary, and I am the assistant coordinator here with Newport Bay Conservancy. So if you've been in touch with anyone over email about this training, I am the face behind those emails. So hello and welcome. I have been here with the Conservancy for just about 3 years now, and my role is to be the main point of contact for our volunteers. So I run volunteer orientations, coordinate with our incredible instructors for this training, as well as other education opportunities. And I manage the process for our volunteers getting signed up for activities when we have activities going on. I would just like to go through a few housekeeping items before I introduce our speaker. For those of you that are enrolled in our full training, I will be sending out an email each week with updates and reminders about the course. So stay tuned for those. You should have already received 2 emails from me, one yesterday welcoming you to the training and one today with a link to the training manual. So if you did not receive those emails and you think that you were registered for the course, please let me know either in the chat window here or by sending me an email, and I'll make sure to forward them along and add you to the registration list. These Thursday night lectures are open to everyone. So the link will always be the same as the one that you used tonight. So feel free to share this link with anyone that you think might be interested. And we will also be posting the recordings to our YouTube channel afterwards, so you can check them out and review anything there. You will be muted throughout this talk so that we get the clearest audio of our presenter, but there will be an opportunity at the end for a Q&A where we will allow you to unmute yourselves to ask questions. So during that time, we just ask that you keep yourself muted when you are not asking a question so that only the speaker is unmuted. That helps with the clarity of the audio. And during the presentation, if you have a question, you're welcome to type it into the chat here, and we'll do our best to get to all of those at the end. Feel free to reach out to me with any questions or feedback about the course at any point. The best way to reach me is by email, and I can put my email address into the chat window here. Without any further ado, I'd like to introduce tonight's speaker. We have Dick Zembal. He is an expert in wetlands and endangered species, former NBC board member, and currently the Natural Resources Director for the Orange County Water District. He has worked for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service for 20 years and has taught at both Cal State Long Beach and Saddleback College. He has been monitoring some of our endangered birds here in the Bay for many years, which you will hear about during his presentation. And he is just a wealth of information, and I'm so excited for you all to hear from him. And I'm going to hand it over to Dick.
Hello, one and all, and welcome. Thank you, Hillary. I have been fooling around in coastal wetlands of Southern California and Baja California, Mexico since the early 1970s. And as a result of that, I have gotten myself vested in a number of projects, places, and species that depend upon our coastal wetlands. Tonight is introductory material for your series of courses on different organisms and history and culture of the Bay. And I just want to say, as part of my introductory remarks, that what you guys do, your participation in all of this, is critical to places like Upper Newport Bay getting their fair due in the eyes of the human population at large. And I want to thank you for taking the time to be involved and encourage you to keep that up. I want you to know that this is, I like doing this on a little more interactive basis. So this feels a little bit like a video chat, I guess, has to me. But hopefully at the end of this, if there's something on here that you have a question about or whatnot, if you would simply jot it down, I'd be more than happy to speak with you. The only other thing I would tell you is that I put together a series of, I think for Newport it was 7 very amateurish and hokey video clips for my natural history class at Saddleback College that deal with very basic stuff. But while we were out for just one morning, and while we were out there, we managed to capture a few things that were interesting and or amusing. And I've shared the links to those video clips with Hillary. If anybody is really bored or you're having trouble sleeping at night, those are available for you to ponder and guffaw over for the amateurishness of them, as well as, in some cases, the subject matter. So again, this presentation is a focus on the coastal wetlands of the Southern California Bight, which includes all of those very rare places that occur along the coast, mostly of Southern California, from Point Conception down to the Mexican border and even into Mexico. In Baja California, Mexico, there's several little tiny wetlands and a couple of large ones, El Estero and San Quintin. San Quintin is massive. This is what you're looking at in this photograph, is one little cove of San Quintin. It's huge by Southern California standards. Most of our wetlands are remaining wetlands are really small. They used to be on the order of 1 to a couple thousand acres, and today they're more on the order of a couple dozen to as many as a couple thousand acres, and that's only up at Point Magoo, and also Tijuana Slough is fairly sizable. And what makes coastal wetlands so unique is the fact that their water are going to figure out how to use that and take advantage of it. And so in the case of a coastal wetland, you look at this photo and you see the hillocks and old volcano cones and the flatlands in the center of the slide there, and that is the coastal wetland, and it's extremely flat. The grade is generally 1 to 24 or even less abrupt than that. Very, very flat over time, and the water you see there is the ocean. And the ocean comes in and waters these flatlands, usually where a creek or a river meets the ocean. The ocean waters come in and water that very special place twice daily. There are generally 2 low and 2 high tides every day in the Southern California Bight, and the really high tides put that whole green area underwater. One of the conditions that organisms that live in a coastal wetland have to be able to contend with. So most of the really rare species of a coastal wetland are resident species. And so part of the reason they're rare is that we don't have a whole lot of acres of coastal wetland. And these organisms are ones that can only survive in that particular very unique type of habitat. Most of our Southern California rare species, their distribution is dictated by the Southern California Bight. Most of them only occur from Point Conception and slightly down into Baja. In the case of a couple, they actually go a little further north than that. One in particular, Salt Marsh Birdspeak, gets all the way up into Morro Bay, pictured here. So hopefully you recognize this. This is the upper end of Upper Newport Bay, looking oceanward at the old salt dike in the upper middle of the slide there. This upper end of the bay below the Y and the bike trail and Moss Center used to be a salt production area that was all diked up in cells, and salt water would be let into those cells and allowed to evaporate, and they would harvest the salt and sell it for various purposes. And then many decades ago, the salt production ended and the dikes were breached. And today, those, particularly the main remnant dike, performs an extremely important function in that if this dike is something like, don't quote me, but something like 4 miles from the ocean. And that's a long way. So by the time the tide reaches its height in the ocean, it's still making its way back to that dike. So the dike is kind of a pinch point that dampens the tide a little bit, at least, above it. And as you'll see later in this talk, that's a really important consideration these days because of global warming, climate change, and sea level rise, which has greatly affected our salt marshes. So a long time ago, we had no idea how important these wetland systems along the coast were for everything from coastal fisheries, nearshore fisheries, crabs, clams, you know, things like halibut, and they're nurseries for fish and extremely important for the food the coastal salt marsh produces, and a lot of which the nutrients produced in the salt marsh, a lot of them are washed out to the nearshore waters and basically fertilize those systems in such a way that it really enhances their productivity. Most of the wetlands we have along the coast of Southern California have been subjected to prolonged closure from the ocean. And that was typically brought about by the placement of Pacific Coast Highway, and before that even the Coast Railroad system. When those were put in, no municipality wanted to spend the kind of money that needed to be spent to make the bridges and over the ocean inlets very big. And so the ocean inlets were confined to a single spot and made very small. And as a result, a lot of them closed off. Well, it turns out if you close off a coastal wetland for very long, it drowns and then dries out and then drowns and dries out. And the plant diversity in that salt marsh goes way down, and the place becomes dominated almost solely by pickleweed, which isn't necessarily a bad thing, particularly if you're a building Savannah Sparrow, but everybody knows biological diversity is generally a good thing. The more diverse the plant life and the habitats you have associated with a habitat patch, the more resilient that habitat patch generally is. And so here we're looking at Agua Hedionda Lagoon, which is one of the San Diego marshes. And you can see in the foreground is bulrush, a brackish marsh. Bulrush is a good indicator of slightly saline soils, brackishness. And then beyond that, the flat with the water associated, that's the salt marsh, that's pickleweed marsh. And then beyond that, on just very slightly higher ground, is again bulrush and cattail marsh. Cattails are generally good indicators of freshwater marsh, a little less brackish than certainly brackish marsh and salt marsh. But what happens on the edge of these wetlands, particularly because they're so small, is extremely important. The organisms that live there, including people, greatly affect what goes on in the wetland itself. You know, one of the cool things about a coastal wetland is the huge diversity and abundance of birds. During the winter, we're along the Pacific Flyway, and shorebirds in the thousands flock along the string of pearls on our coast to fatten up through the winter on the huge invertebrate populations contained on and in the mudflats of the salt marsh in particular. And then the associated brackish and freshwater marshes on the edge of a place like Upper Newport Bay has its own suite of bird species that are particularly tied to those kinds of habitats. You see American bitterns occasionally out in the salt marsh, but freshwater and brackish marsh are really more their habitat than a salt marsh. And then of course you have a little ubiquitous now in Orange County black Phoebe, and they are associated with any kind of habitat that has an abundance of insects, and goodness knows that the wetlands do. Phoebes are aerial hunters of insects and very adept at it. They're really fun to watch. When we were filming recently at Upper Newport Bay, I was loath to not be able to get close enough to a Phoebe or a Say's or a black Phoebe to watch them for a time, because they are characters, and they sit on perches adjacent to turf or open water, lower habitats, waiting for an insect to fly up, and then they sally out from that perch and grab the insect in the air, bring it back to the perch and beat it up before swallowing it. Very, very cool. Make a mud nest, often in association with water, with a little waterfall in particular. One of the things that really got me involved in coastal wetlands, besides a buddy of mine who also got me started in California lease terns, was a penchant for wanting to behave like a biological detective. And back in the 70s, there was a newly listed endangered bird that I'm going to spend some time talking about, the light-footed clapper rail, then today the light-footed ridgeways rail. I dare you to say that fast 5 times without getting your tongue tied in knots. And I also wanted to show you this slide to look at this cordgrass. This is on the north side of Upper Island, in Upper Newport Bay, not too far off of Back Bay Drive. And that cordgrass is just about up to my hip in spots. Anymore in the lower bay, and in that exact location, you would be hard pressed to find sprigs of cordgrass anywhere near that tall, let alone that dense. And that has made a huge difference for the organism that calls the cordgrass home. The more tidally influenced coastal wetland is, the healthier that particular coastal wetland is, except for sea level rise. But if you close a coastal wetland off from the ocean, like what happened in 1985 in Tijuana Marsh, the entire place turns into a soggy, hypersaline pond, and predators get every single last one of the birds reliant on the coastal marsh, including the endangered rail. So it's got to have good tidal exchange for rails to be an occupant of a coastal wetland. One of the things that's happening in recent times is coastal salt marsh restoration. It's very expensive the way it's done today. But this is one of the more recent in Orange County, although Bolsa Chica was after this. This is the little Talbert Marsh, down 18 acres, I think it is, down. It's the piece of marsh in the Huntington Beach wetland strip, closest to the Huntington State Beach leased tern colony and closest to the Santa Ana River. Took many years, but there's really good plant diversity now in that little wetland. Here's the new opening for tidal flushing the Bolsa Chica wetland. This was just after that new ocean inlet was opened in 2006, and one of the very first visitors of note from the ocean was a 4-foot long leopard shark, which is very cool and exciting. You don't have to know a lot of plants to be a salt marsh expert. In Southern California, there's maybe 30 some species that are able to make it in that particular habitat. But the ones that do live in a coastal wetland grow like crazy. I mean, think about it. Southern California sunshine, 350 days or so a year, and all the water you can drink if you know how to use salt water. But you also have to be able to contend with saturated soils. Something you know if you, like I, have around any house plants, most plants take a soil atmosphere to be able to survive. Because the soil in the salt marsh is saturated, coastal wetland plants have found ways of coping with gas exchange other than through the roots. They do so through the stems and stomata on the underside of leaves rather than through the roots. If you're a salt marsh plant, you got to be able to hold your breath. You can go underwater twice a day. And you need to be able to contend with a heavy salt load. So plants like annual pickleweed here are succulents. A lot of the salt marsh plants are succulents, so they can store water. And if you bite into one of these stems, you discover that there are two different strategies for dealing with a salt load. The pickleweeds of the world simply get saltier than the salt water. They incorporate the salt into their own tissue, as evidenced by biting into one of those. Whereas the grasses, cordgrass, for example, exudes the salt. And so in the early morning, and the sun is just hitting the cordgrass leaves, it looks like they have tiny diamonds on the outside of their leaves, salt crystals that have formed from the exuded salt. Another couple of the salt marsh plants, the one in bloom here is salt marsh maidens, a little Jamea carnosa, a little diminutive succulent sunflower in the sunflower family. In the center of the foreground, you see those tiny little linear leaved organisms. That's actually shoregrass, one of the more common middle and upper marsh grasses of the salt marsh. And then the gray leaves belong to one of the salt bushes, a diminutive one that occurs in the salt marsh, Atroplex watsonii, Watson's salt bush. And then on the right there, you probably recognize ice plant, freeway plant. One of the best invaders of the salt marsh species is saltgrass. It spreads by stems called stolons that just keep growing, and they grow in and around and through things, and every so often the plant roots again. Saltgrass isn't confined to the upper elevations of the salt marsh. You can also find it just about anywhere where there's a little bit of moisture and saltiness, even in the desert. And this is probably the most unusual of the native salt marsh plants. This is our native sea lavender. Unusual because it's not very succulent, big leathery leaves. And that's unusual for a salt marsh plant. Most of the salt marsh plants are either diminutive succulents or they're grasses. So this guy is kind of a very attractive oddball, little bicolored flowers, blue and white, turn kind of a pinkish. And then the most unusual plant of all growing in the salt marsh, and you can see this along Back Bay Drive, growing on a number of host plants. The orange string that you're looking at is the plant itself. The little white flowers belong to that orange screen, orange string, and that is dodder, or witch's hair, which is a parasitic plant that is species specific. The species of dodder that grows in the salt marsh is different than the one that grows in the uplands on plants that don't go underwater very often and that kind of thing. There's some unusual plants on the edge of the salt marsh as well. You don't often see Anemopsis growing in the salt marsh proper. This, I think, is probably a shot taken from Bolsa Chica, but we have lizard tail at Upper Newport Bay as well. It's probably most common in Big Canyon along the Bobcat Trail there on the edge of the riparian habitat. It likes mucky conditions, or at least seasonal muck. And again, isn't a true vine. It kind of grows by runners, and big, beautiful flowers, cone-shaped pistil there that develops the seed, or ovary there that develops seeds later in the year. Very common salt marsh head species. And then one of the rarest plants we have in all of Southern California is salt marsh birdspeak. You're looking at the salt marsh at the corner of Shellmaker and Back Bay Drive, at the backside of the Cal Fish and Wildlife sign there in the background. And all those little white tufts out there are flower heads of endangered salt marsh birdspeak. Salt marsh birdspeak is rare because it only occurs in coastal wetlands, and it only occurs under certain conditions in coastal wetlands. I have found that it likes a little bit of freshet. So just about every place where there's big thriving colonies of salt marsh birdspeak at Upper Newport Bay, long ago I dug pits and tested the salinity of the groundwater and found that seepage off of the bluffs would come into the salt marsh underground and influence the salinity of the soil there, and greatly benefiting salt marsh birdspeak. This is a member of the snapdragon family, and it is a hemiparasite. It has little root hairs called Hestoria that form connection with a host plant. In my experience, it really likes shoregrass, but it will grow on any number of upper marsh plants in a very narrow elevational belt in the higher salt marsh. Interestingly, salt marsh birdspeak, that elevational belt is the same one that non-native Algerian sea lavender likes to invade at Upper Newport Bay, and it's also the same elevational belt that the state endangered belting Savannah sparrow likes to nest at. Salt marsh birdspeak is called birdspeak because those little tufts of snapdragon flowers are sort of reminiscent of a nest full of baby birds thrusting their bills skyward, begging for food. Every baby bird you will ever see, particularly passerines, have either yellow, orange, or red lip linings, little targets for the parents that they open and begging for food. And this is a map of the occurrence of salt marsh birdspeak along the California coast. I kind of threw Morro Bay in there. It's actually further north than that, but that's okay. Carpinteria Marsh, Ormond Beach, and Magoo Lagoon have little populations, and the one that's not on here because it's an introduced population, and we'll see how it does over time without tending by people, is the Huntington Beach wetlands. Now has a little population that was planted Years ago, Barbara Massey and I planted salt marsh birdspeak at Seal Beach. And I learned firsthand the importance of the upland wetland interface and the interconnections and complications between organisms that inhabit one and the other. We put out 300 and something like 358 salt marsh birdspeak seeds, and the following year every single one of those seeds became a plant and flowered. And the year after that there were about 100 flowering plants, and the year after that there were 28, and the year after that there were none. Salt marsh birdspeak has a closed corolla in the snapdragon family. It takes a robust pollinator to break into that corolla and pollinate the flowers. And Seal Beach, the upper marsh edge, has been so badly beat up, there just aren't native colonies of ground nesting bees or anything else flying around to pollinate the plants, at least back in those days. And so our attempt at establishing a new population there failed. This is, I don't know if I wrote down the year, this is the population that I discovered, making it 10 on the San Diego River. Salt marsh birdspeak, when it's in flower, is nice and green and photosynthetic, and as it gets more and more into seed, it stops photosynthesizing, turns red, and depends more and more on its host plant for nutrients and moisture. But in the foreground of this, and you can see the abundance of shoregrass, this is definitely growing in and among shoregrass, which is probably the host. But in the foreground, sort of on the left there, those broader leaves, that is sadly Algerian sea lavender, which I tried to pay for a project to get removed from the San Diego River near Dog Beach. And the folks that got on it didn't get on it very well. They got really discouraged because it's a very tough plant to take care of. I think I talk about this plant a little more here with a few different pictures, so I'll hit that up bigger later. Now, I look at the leaves on this one, and this looks probably like European sea lavender. Algerian sea lavender has more elongated leaves, whereas European sea lavender has these rounded leaves you see in the foreground here. Both are from the nursery industry escapes into our Southern California environment. And the problem with them is that when they really get established, form dense mass and disallow anything else to grow. I mean, they literally choke out everything, including salt marsh birdspeak and building Savannah sparrows. Well, I guess I'd talk about this right now. Hopefully you recognize the moose center up there in the background. This is the density that Algerian sea lavender and European sea lavender can attain in the salt marsh environment. So the taped off area there, we taped it off. Cal Fish and Wildlife went in there and was experimenting with herbicides to see the efficacy of spraying them rather than meticulously planting, digging these things up one plant at a time, which I personally have spent hundreds of hours doing, and many others as well, including Randall. And it's a worthy pursuit because in the context of what's inside that tape, there's no more salt marsh birdspeak there, I can guarantee you, and there's no room for buildings nests. That habitat is not structured appropriately for buildings to be able to use that to nest in. What you see just beyond the tape, those black tarps, are thick black plastic that the process, you stake those down, process is called solarization. You leave them for 2-3 months, depending on how hot it gets. and it gets really hot under that tarp and literally fries everything growing there under. So dozens of hours saved, not having to remove all those plants by hand. And this is kind of what it looks like in the aftermath. The plants that are still green there on lower left were on the outside of the tape. The ones on the inside are all brown and dead, and we have reason to believe that the seeds even get toasted to the point where they won't re-sprout. And then in the sort of middle upper right, you see some opaque looking little stringy plants. That is etiolated salt marsh heather or heath, I think. Anyway, one of the native plants lost all its chlorophyll, but it survived, and it comes back really quickly to take over that solarization site. So that's actually kind of cool. We've had lots and lots. The Naturalists are sponsoring this now. A project I started with Heather Sizzlestick eons ago. I won't attempt to pronounce her name correctly. That's close enough. Anyway, we've had all kinds of groups out there. Randall's brought his co-workers along with him a time or two, and Saddleback College and UC Irvine and whatnot, putting down new tarps and hand picking to try to keep the Algerian sea lavender at bay. You know, many naturalists worldwide consider the #1 ecological issue in the United States and around the world today to be the pervasion of non-native invasive species. There are thousands of species that are introduced to a spot that in the world that they never occurred in before annually, and some of those take and go crazy. Red Swamp Mangrove was introduced for a research project in the University of California Kendall Frost Reserve in northern Mission Bay next to Campland. And we thought we had gotten it all out of there, but still today we find plants, even like this one, all the way to fruiting, which means that there are a number of big, thick roots that have already spun off of this mother plant and are out there under the marsh, and you won't even know they're there until they come up in the form of a new plant. You know, now that I'm on this and sea level rise, I can't think of a cheaper way of raising the marsh plain than sticking something non-native like this plant out there on our marsh plain. Because if you have those kind of heavy duty roots, that's your best chance of gathering up the bit of sediment that still comes in down San Diego Creek and in and out with the tides. But having said that, you know, I've spent my entire career advocating against non-native invasive species and fighting many of them. So go figure, real quandary. Here's another butte that we found in Frost. This is a Mexican fiddler crab. And of course, in terms of worldwide introductions, oceanic vessels are perhaps the worst. I mean, they're picking up ballast water, you know, goodness knows where, with the spores and the eggs and the spawn of hundreds of organisms. And then they travel hundreds or thousands of miles and they dump that water and take on fresh ballast water. And in dumping that water is the grand experiment. All of the major ports of the world are just teeming with species that don't belong there. And that very well could be how a Mexican fiddler crab got into northern Mission Bay. Could also be the pet trade, who knows? One of the things I'd like to emphasize to you, I hope that you get involved in tours and talking to people about the bay and trying to hook them on the wild creatures that live there. There's so many cool animals, not the least of which is the cottontail. I mean, I could spend an entire, Hillary forgot to tell me how long. I think I have 5 hours to talk to you. So, but if that's not right, you can tell me after 5 hours. Anyway, I could spend an entire lecture of an hour or two talking about nothing but cottontail rabbits and what they do and the populations that they support and the role they play in the environment, culling grass and keeping it reasonably heightened and one thing or another. But these little guys, they don't live in a salt marsh. Salt marsh, the tides come and go. They live in the uplands where it's generally dry, but they actually get into the salt marsh, particularly the edge. There's lots of thatchy plants that grow there where they can make a little nest hovel and have their youngins in. There's lots of good things to eat, and you get some vitamins out of that salt, ocean salt as well. Probably the biggest invaders from the edge of the marsh are California ground squirrels. These guys are omnivores who will eat anything that they can grab a hold of, including birds, bird eggs, baby birds, invertebrates, as well as plant material. And again, lots of nutrients and vitamins in the things that they can munch with sea salt. In studies that I have conducted, I've actually done small mammal trapping in several of the, obviously in the upper marsh and the salt pan at the very highest end of the marsh, generally speaking. But the deer mouse and the western harvest mouse are some of the most abundant small mammals on the Santa Margarita. The deer mouse was by far the most abundant small mammal in the extreme upper marsh. Another really common one is California Metamouse or vole. And many has been the time I've been out in a canoe or a kayak during high tide, and I see one or more of these little guys swimming for their lives, having been marooned during a super high tide with no upland habitat to sequester in, swimming frantically to try to get to the adjacent uplands. These are semi-fossorial creatures, meaning that they don't actually dig burrows, but they like a semi-burrow type life where things like saltgrass and shoregrass form a thatch in the upper marsh, and they will burrow right along, partly into the ground and partly through that thatch, forming little tunnel systems. And so they're very common in the upper marsh. One of the most common urban omnivores, sadly, is a non-native marsupial. The Virginia possum is very abundant in the uplands on the edge of salt marshes, and they also are omnivores that will venture out into the salt marsh after whatever they can get a hold of. They're notorious egg suckers, and if they can find a nest, they'll take every egg they can. The connection between the uplands and the wetlands is vitally important. Salt marsh in and of itself, none of ours remaining in Southern California are large enough to stay healthy in and of themselves. They are reliant for a healthy food web on adjacent habitats and huge connected open space. So the food web doesn't collapse on them, particularly with reference to native top carnivores. Very few of our wetlands do I ever encounter our native mule deer. Los Penasquitos is one of few exceptions where I typically will see mule deer in the upper marsh and on the edge of the marsh in the riparian community. You know you're in a place in spring with abundant big animals like mule deer when ticks are all over the place. When I walk through Los Penasquitos Lagoon, the upper marsh pickleweed below Torrey Pines State Park, I have to check my pants regularly because I'll be covered in ticks. And if you don't catch it before they get a chance to imbibe in their blood meal so they can successfully reproduce, they grow many times their normal size, feasting on you. The aquatic snakes are not the only ones that get into the salt marsh. Actually, I don't think I've ever even seen a garter snake at Upper Newport Bay. Doesn't mean they're not there. I've seen them at Camp Pendleton. The most abundant snake that I ever encountered in the salt marshes of Southern California is the Southern Pacific rattlesnake. They are extremely common, and it's just a sign that some of the wetlands are still large enough and non-intruded upon enough that there's enough room for a creature like this to be able to survive. Many has been the day up at Magoo Lagoon when I encounter more rattlesnakes than I do endangered birds. They live on the old beach ridges there, and there's just an abundance of small mammals for them to forage upon, as well as birds. They'll take birds as well. They are ambush hunters that pose very little danger to humans unless you're really not paying attention to what you're doing. They're a little scary at a place like Magoo because they so seldom see humans other than me that they're basically curious. I think it's only been a couple of times that I've had one of them even buzz at me to let me know that they were there. In terms of interpreting the wetland, what goes on in the salt marsh, the function of a salt marsh, the huge productivity and the food made available to wildlife as well as people, that's the main message. But trying to get people stoked on Upper Newport Bay and really share what's going on there, you need to learn something about the birds. Because birds are really cool. Every bird that occurs out there has a unique niche that only they occupy. You look at a shorebird and you think, well, they've all got these elongated bills and they all, suck stuff out of the mud. Well, that's true to a point, but they're using different layers of the mud. They're at the mud water interface or in shallow water or in mudflat that's been out of the water for a time. It turns out that several of them are more specialists than we thought. The birds of prey are really easy ones to get people excited about, particularly the osprey, since we got an active nesting platform there at Upper Newport Bay now. That's an easy one to get people excited about, learn a little bit about, so you can kind of convey it. But you got to learn the shorebirds. I mean, you've got I don't know if the number's even on here. Oh, there's more than 6 species. I think there's 9 species in this photograph. And it's not a great photograph on purpose. So to make you have to know them well enough to be able to pick them out one from another. Everything from black-bellied plover to killdeer and whimbrel and Caspian tern, long-billed curlew, long-billed dowitcher, marbled godwit, dunlin, and the like. Anyway, learn the birds. They're very cool, fun to watch. Our second smallest would be the Western Sandpiper here in breeding plumage. This is way larger than a Western Sandpiper is in real life. Our Willet, looking very nondescript and gray, a little bit lighter underneath, until it gives its raucous call and flashes the white and black wing patches meant to confuse and distract a would-be attacker, so it escapes unscathed. One of the largest of our shorebirds, or the largest of ours, but one of the largest shorebirds there is, long-billed curlew. You see these guys with muddy faces trying to get even deeper into the mud than that 6-inch probe will take them after the goodies that are found therein. Millions of organisms in a typical cubic meter of mud forming a salt marsh mud flat. Just extremely productive habitat in and of itself. Lots of different kinds of waterfowl. The northern pintail in breeding plumage is very easy to tell from other species. That long tail feather protruding out the back, and the reddish brown head with the white neck stripe. Killdeer is an interesting little resident shorebird. You know, the plovers are a group of shorebirds that have these plump little bodies, and the bills are not as outlandishly lengthy as a lot of the shorebirds. They're surface gleaners, and you know, they chase down small running insects and the like. But the most outlandish thing about the killdeer, it's a year-round resident in Southern California, and not just confined to coastal wetlands. They nest in the open. Most birds nest in some kind of cover. The killdeer nests right out in the open. Their nest is usually lined with little rocks, and which those camouflage eggs perfectly match. And when they sit still, even though they're right out in the open, they blend in, particularly when their eyes are closed, so well with the substrate. They're very difficult to spot, but they incorporate the broken wing display in their nest defense. So if they see a predator coming, they get off the nest when the predator isn't looking, and if it's coming toward them, they wait until it's distracted, and they move further from their nest. And finally, when they get far enough away that they think maybe the nest is safe, they start going into contusions and gyrations, making it look like they can't make another step, and basically leading a would-be predator away from the nest, so that they save their eggs and or chick. And then when the predator follows them and they're very safely distant from the nest, they simply heal themselves and fly away, giving that raucous call that sounds a little bit like their name. Black-necked stilt is another year-round resident shorebird, a very striking bird that hunts in shallow water with an unusual behavior. You'd think with that long skinny bill that they spend their time probing, whereas when you watch them forage, most of their food is gleaned from little insects and invertebrate that are floating on the surface of the water. They're surgically picking these tiny little morsels right off the water surface. We have several species of terns that nest locally at Bolsa Chica. We have California least terns that nest at Upper Newport Bay, not very abundantly these days, but we're working on ways to fix that. Terns are closely related to the gulls, whites and blacks and grays in different conformations. Foresters' terns are salt marsh nesters. They actually nest on flotsam in the outer marsh, big floating racks of seaweed and kelp and cordgrass. particularly those that lodge in the far marsh. They will communally nest, making giant volcano-shaped nests and lay their 2 or 3 eggs and incubate with helpers and actually pull off youngsters. Belted kingfisher is a very cool bird that hunts fish by plunge diving, as do the terns. In many different types of aquatic situations, you can find these guys on mountain streams and estuaries and bayments in Southern California. Very abundant. But what's cool about the belted kingfisher at Upper Newport Bay is they actually nest there. Kingfisher nesting habitat is very specialized. It's generally a hollow, a hole in a vertical creek bank, which we have right along the Delhi Channel, where it turns to go into the salt marsh. And the birds there have nested for a number of years now. One of the rarest of the rail inhabitants of our coastal Southern California wetlands, although they're very abundant in some marshes in Northern California and elsewhere in the United States, is the little black rail. I look back through my notes, and the last one I heard in Upper Newport Bay, I'm out there surveying rails every year. The last one I heard was in 2014 during a rail survey at the upper end of the bay. Cool little birds, but unusual visitors. They're not regulars, particularly today. So one of the species I'm going to spend some time on, because you're stuck with it. I've spent 40 years trying to champion the cause of coastal wetlands, and particularly this inhabitant of coastal wetlands, the light-footed, supposed to be ridgeways rail, excuse me, I call it clapper rail all night. That's just the kind of guy I am. Very handsome birds. And Upper Newport Bay at one point in time was housed the premier population of light-footed rails. When I first started studying rails, nobody even knew how to count them. So first things we did was tackle how to do that. And we tried high tide counts from watercraft and from the edge of the wetlands using spotting scopes and whatnot. And during a high enough tide today, most marshes go all the way under, whereas 20, 30 years ago, that was not the case. There were only a few that went underwater enough to be able to do this successfully. So when we do a high tide count at Seal Beach, this is what we're looking for. A lot of the birds are just hanging out on whatever still provides them a perch or cover, and we're simply doing a physical count. That turned out not to be a good way of actually assessing the breeding potential of the rail population in a given marsh. And so instead, what we turned to was nest searching, which is painful because the nests are very camouflaged, very difficult to find. You're right out in the habitat when they're trying to nest. So your activity can be disturbing, particularly if you don't know what you're doing, like us at the beginning of all this. And what you're basically looking for, and maybe you already know this, is sort of in the lower center, kind of toward the left, you can see the green of the cordgrass blades displayed a little bit more heavily than the rest of that cordgrass stand. That's because the rail that's sitting on a nest underneath that is pulling those blades down and intertwining them over the top of the nest. So if a high tide comes in, that bird can simply leave that nest made of dried cordgrass, which floats, and the eggs will be jammed between the floating nest and the canopy they have created by interweaving the cordgrass grass blades. There's a closer look at a canopy, and bottom center, you can kind of make out an egg and a piece of another egg through the center there. Very specialized nesting habitat. And it's not that they don't nest in other places, in other, like they'll nest under pickleweed and stuff too, but the pickleweed has to be somewhat connected, not connected, protected from the uplands, so that the tides wash away the evidence of their having been there. So, you know, old beach ridges and places like that in thick pickleweed, they'll also use those kind of places. And in some places, some years, they'll even just use flotsam, sort of the way that the foresters' terns do, except they tend to nest under the flotsam rather than on it. This is a close-up of the eggs. They're about the size of a small chicken egg, speckled in maroon like that, particularly on the broader end of the egg. And here's a look at a typical nest situation at Point Mugu. Point Mugu has huge issues with gigantic raptor populations. And so the rails there have taken to nesting in spiny rush. And so they've got natural built-in anti-perching devices on that spiny rush. Of course, the places where the spiny rush grows are teeming with southern Pacific rattlesnakes. So they're trading one would-be predator group for another. And then in Upper Newport Bay, believe it or not, you're riding your bike or walking along Back Bay Drive in the springtime, you could be within feet of a nest of a light-footed clapper rail. They love the bulrush cattail belt along the edge of Back Bay Drive, between Back Bay Drive and the salt marsh. They treat this habitat you know, like it's cordgrass on steroids, and use it quite abundantly. Well, nest searching proved to be extremely time-consuming, other issues associated with it. So I started listening at clapper rail vocalizations and determined that their namesake call was the one that they announced their territoriality with, and all I really had to do is just stay on the edge of marsh in the evening or early morning long enough to hear everybody give that call and map where they were calling from. And I had a pretty good idea of who was nesting where in that particular piece of marsh. So every spring for the past 40 years, I've gone out to our Southern California wetlands from Tijuana up to Carpinteria and surveyed with help from others the breeding population of light-footed clapper rails for the state. I put together a clapper rail recovery group, clapper rail team, if you will, and we did lots of stuff together, largely staffed by volunteers, but we got some grant money and some government funding as well. And so we do things like fashion traps and put them out in the tidal creeks that clapper rails would normally hunt through anyway. And we caught a fair number of rails, and we put radios on a few of them, particularly at Upper Newport Bay, to learn more about their habits and where they were going and where they were spending their time and that kind of a thing. We started all this in 1979 with studies, very basic studies of breeding biology of the clapper rail. And one of the things we did was we focused on the Seal Beach National Wildlife Refuge as well as Upper Newport Bay, because Upper Newport Bay seemed to have a lot of rails, although nobody knew how many. And Seal Beach had twice as much habitat, but way fewer rails, just based on anecdotal observations. one of the things we discovered at Seal Beach is that marsh there had sank, and that sinking caused tidal access to most of the nests the rails put on the ground. As a result, the rails took to nesting under tumbleweeds and other things that happened to have lodged in the short little meager habitat, and some of those eggs in such nests actually survived. And later we mimicked that in an attempt to provide artificial nesting sites, as you'll see here in a moment. We looked at the food habits of the clapper rail. We used observations. We videotaped rails as they're foraging to try to determine what they were spending their time doing. And the long and the short of it is they eat just about anything that moves out there in the salt marsh, and even some things that are not really that associated with the salt marsh. But the weird thing is they spend hours consuming these tiny little salt marsh denizens, invertebrates, on the substrate and under flotsam. And I guess those are like the vitamin pills and whatnot. And then in the flash of an eye, they go into a tidal creek and pull out a crab that probably 10 times greater mass-wise than the sum total of all the little things they just spent hours consuming earlier. They really depend on crabs, I think, for the bulk of their diet, but they take a whole lot of other things as well. And even island organisms like here, western fence lizard, they love going after crickets and grasshoppers in the upper marsh. And so it's not unusual to find them in the uplands, particularly when the tide is high. They'll perch in whatever shrub is right on the edge of the marsh. We've done contaminants investigations. I have always been concerned when Upper Newport Bay gets dredged yet again, because that activity, even if one didn't want it to, undoubtedly unleashes pesticides that have been buried in sediment for long periods of time and potentially remobilizing those into the food chain. A graduate student of mine looked at the fact that clapper rails, even after a successful nest hatch at Upper Newport Bay, always seem to leave a couple, 1, 2, or 3 eggs behind. And then we started making observations on the mudflat and noted that many of the broods had chicks in them of different, often 2 different ages. So my hypothesis is that the rails do not wait to start incubation until a full clutch is laid. And in there is some assurance that at least those early eggs are going to hatch after the shortest possible incubation time. The later eggs, if the rails are left undisturbed, they'll come back and continue to incubate those as they brood the chicks. And then those hatch anywhere from 1 or 2 days to several days later. We took some of these unhatched remaining eggs and did contaminants investigations on them, and they're not chemical dump eggs or anything like that, which was one of my hypotheses. The things affecting coastal wetlands today, some of them are the things that have always affected coastal wetlands. They're pinched off from the ocean, largely because PCH and the Coast Railroad did not bother to spend the money they needed to adequately span the inlets to the ocean. And so today we spend thousands and thousands and thousands of dollars dredging out lagoon mouths that can't move and are smaller than what they need to be to keep coastal wetlands open. But this is important enough that it's got to continue, because if you pinch these coastal wetlands off from the ocean, you're going to kill off the majority of your biodiversity over time in that coastal wetland. This is Tijuana Estuary, closed off in 1985 and closed off again. Tijuana's got all kinds of problems. The eutrophication has been caused by over nitrification from sewage that gets into the water in Tijuana, and then the river mouth closes and all that gunk winds up in the coastal wetland. And just last year we had such a depletion of oxygen that thousands of leopard shark pups came belly up in the water. Not a good thing. And we now have permits in place that we can open that lagoon mouth when it is required as quickly as possible, so that things like eutrophication are disallowed. But as I mentioned before, you know, that our coastal wetlands are all so small, the remaining ones, that whatever happens on the edge is really important. The healthiest coastal wetlands are those that have open space on the edge, like Upper Newport Bay. When you've got houses right up on the edge, pet cats, believe it or not, dogs, little Johnny and his pellet gun, there's all kinds of potential issues for anything wanting to use that edge. So basically what you've done is you've shrank the size of that marsh yet again by, 20% or more, because there's a disturbance belt associated with the edge that penetrates into the marsh and keeps organisms from being able to live there in a viable, healthy manner. The loss of salt marsh habitat, is a tragedy in many ways, none greater than the fact that these are places that have always been congregations for wintering raptor populations. We have huge numbers of red tails that come in and overwinter in our coastal wetlands. Pete Bloom and I years ago did banding studies and whatnot in the Seal Beach National Wildlife Refuge and documented the use by that wetland of 253 different individual red-tailed hawks. And even today, during the winter, you can see phenomenon there, like 8 different red tails on the ground fighting over a single gopher kill. The concentration puts untoward pressure on the wetlands. These same birds will get into the wetlands and hunt something like a clapper rail running along a trail. Looks nothing, looks similar enough to a ground squirrel or whatnot that they are going to go after a rail. I used to think that northern harriers were too small to take on rails, but repeatedly I've seen big females take rails, and even in the process of teaching their youngsters how to hunt rails during high tides, we have moved several such individuals up to the Sacramento National Wildlife Refuge and banded them and documented that they stayed put and lived out their lives up there. They're not as mobile, as migratory as the red tails are. Huge numbers of red tails. For those of you who know him, that's Pete Bloom's arm, but that may have been 40 or more years ago that photo was taken. So concern over a particular species of the salt marsh, besides salt marsh in general, and advocating for marsh restoration done sensibly and as economically as possible with sea level rise in mind. Years ago, a couple of friends and I set out to try to create marsh hummocks for rails to nest on in Seal Beach because they didn't have enough good nesting spots. And so we figured we'd just add some soil and build up some marsh hummocks and maybe the rails would nest on them. And that's what the finished product looked like after a work. I can't tell you how many permits, including a coastal zone permit. We produced a bunch of marsh hummocks, and they proved to be too small. We didn't get a single rail used as single one of our hummocks, although we did get a belting Savannah Sparrow nesting on a couple of them. So then, as clever as I am, I decided that I like the idea of the rails choosing tumbleweeds to nest under, but many of those eggs were still being washed away. So I thought, in order to prevent that, I would simply put something that floats under the tumbleweed and anchor that in place with a couple of dowels. And lo and behold, in 1986, the first artificial nesting platform for light-footed clepperils was put into Seal Beach. In 1987, I put out 28 in Seal Beach, and lo and behold, every single one of those was used by a rail for something. Many of them were nested upon. They're important during high tide, particularly today. They are high tide refugia. This is old school type nesting raft. They've gone through an evolution that's actually kind of scary and look very different today. Here's a fiberglass model that you've got to be The Rock or somebody of similar build to carry a bunch of these out into a salt marsh and deploy them, made of fiberglass. They're very heavy, but the cover is very long lasting, and I actually kind of like this design. Kind of expensive as well. Here's a simpler design that doesn't use the dowels. The dowels kind of show from a pretty great distance, and these, the PVC arms, if you simply paint them camouflage, they don't stick out too much. But the quackgrass only lasts a year. I was so disappointed. I thought in the salt marsh environment with all that salt, maybe that grass would be on there for 10 years. Not so. And they're kind of expensive. So yeah, here's the problem. You put out a bunch of stuff like this, and there are other things that are gonna want to sit on them, and some of those actually eat rails. So we started having to install anti-raptor perching devices, which are expensive little bamboo stakes that you might also use in your garden. Then immediately after putting out these rafts and being all proud of myself and thinking I was on my way to fame and riches beyond belief for saving an endangered bird, non-native red foxes caught on to the fact that there is a meal to be had at these rafts on the Seal Beach National Wildlife Refuge. So in 1984, I think it was, we saw 7 red foxes out foraging in broad daylight and only 3 rails. In 1985, I'm not sure we saw a rail, only red foxes. So we started taking red foxes out of Seal Beach. They're non-native. They hunt like a cross between a dog and a cat. Our native wildlife has no evolutionary knowledge ingrained over time as to how to deal with these creatures. So it just wasn't fair. Red foxes were eating everything that lived in or on the ground, and about to cause the extirpation of the rail from Seal Beach, as well as the least turn. In a single evening, 1 red fox got into the least turn nesting colony on NASA Island and destroyed something like 67 of 72 nests. Not to eat the eggs, but to hide them to come back later for a later meal. So in 1 year alone, 1988, we took 128 red foxes out of this little 5,000 acre naval weapons station, an area so small that in and of itself, it couldn't house viably a single family of coyotes. But eventually we prevailed, even though we were sued by PETA for doing this, who wanted to choose beauty over endangerment. we whooped them bad in court, but of course they wouldn't allow us to go after court fees, court charges. And what we discovered in this extremely expensive lesson was that we were dealing with habitat isolation. This is the Kendall Frost Reserve, that's Campland on the right, on the edge of Kendall Frost's 40-acre salt marsh that is entirely urbanized around the edge. In that context, there's absolutely no way of maintaining an intact, viable food web. So small to medium-sized predators, their populations exploded on the edge of Kendall Frost, which is less than a mile in extent. This is a phenomenon known as mesopredator release. Coyotes were no longer accessing Kendall Frost Reserve, the edge of the bay, so that natural predator control that they exert on smaller predator populations was gone. And we had to replace being able to have coyotes access Kendall Frost with regularity. We had to replace that natural condition with predator management, which we pay for dearly annually. And some years, we take 10 feral cats out of the edge of the marsh. Some years it's 24 opossums, 30 rats, might be a dozen skunks or raccoons. It's never ending. One of the reasons we found out it's never ending is because apparently animal control releases problem animals they catch in neighborhoods at Campland. And of course, those Campland animals wind up in Kendall Frost. And so we, with taxpayers' money, are out in Kendall Frost, rounding them up and doing the thing that we're stuck doing. I was concerned at one point in time, I wasn't hearing or seeing coyote sign as abundantly in Upper Newport Bay as I had been. And so a friend of mine and I embarked on coyote investigations. Actually, where the townhouses are now, above San Joaquin Hills Road, there used to be a coyote den that was active annually, but they simply moved, and they're still denning there, which is good. Having their presence is really important because it's a natural control on some of the other small predator populations. It's not 100% because we're so urbanized on the edge of Upper Newport Bay, and because there's giant escape cover for raccoons in particular in Big Canyon and at the upper end of the bay, the non-native forest there. There's huge raccoon population that is able to survive in spite of regular coyote presence. One of these days, I would very much like to be part of getting rid of that non-native forest in particular and turning that back into soft wetlands. But not the time to be focusing on something like that for me right now. You can see the red line is direction of travel, what we actually tracked the coyotes doing. After I had compiled this slide, I actually have sightings of our collared coyotes on the coastal side of Spyglass over all the way into Crystal Cove. And so they're running the green belts, and at night even running the roads and cruising some of the most expensive real estate in all of Southern California in Big Canyon, constantly staving off people who want to go out and shoot coyotes because this is a very important point. If you're going to have the privilege of living on the edge of open space, you have to take the responsibility, part of the responsibility for those wild creatures. We need coyotes. people can train coyotes to be bad actors, and we don't want that, but that takes educating people so that we don't wind up in a situation like that. And that's where folks like you come in. So over the years, we've done genetic studies and determined that all of the remaining light-footed clapper rail populations had bottlenecked and were in deep genetic trouble. So I started moving eggs around. That got really tedious because trying to find eggs that match perfectly incubation timing from a big marsh with a big population to a small marsh with a small population was horrific. I managed to move a few dozen eggs, which hatched successfully. But in 1998, I took the first Upper Newport Bay clapper rail out of the wild and placed him into captivity at the Living Coast Discovery Center, then known as the Chula Vista Nature Center. I want you to make note of the heavy-duty funding we've always worked with the rails, very high-tech, expensive conveyance gear. This, on the other hand, was a breeding facility that cost over 300 grand that Dr. Stephen Neidecker did a fundraiser for and came up with the funding. Again, Chula Vista Nature Center, that's where the first rails went. Nothing happened in 98, nothing happened until 2001 when I put a second pair of potentially breeding rails into captivity, and then the interaction between those pairs, we finally got breeding. And in 2001, the first captive bred rail was released up at Magoo. Not long after that, the wonderful folks at SeaWorld got involved, and I can't say enough about this organization, at least what it was in the past. A totally class act. Their involvement in native species management has been a boon for many beleaguered species of Southern California, hugely saddened by the utter nonsense that rights to lifers have caused them. And there's been a dramatic change in character of the place as well, although they still try. SeaWorld, just a class act. Lori Conrad was the contact there at the time when we started all this, nurturing and caring for the young rails. In my opinion, they went overboard with breeding the rails, not wanting them to imprint. They went above and beyond, camouflaging themselves and using a puppet, as well as, mom feeding them as a pair of forceps. It makes you wonder what they do if they found an old doll or metal forceps out in the marsh someday. Might just squat on it, sighing mama. And these are just shots of caretaking. We learned a lot by bringing these birds into breeding facilities. Most recently, we've got a couple of pairs at Safari Park, San Diego Zoo Safari Park, pairs at SeaWorld, San Diego, and pairs also at the Living Coast Discovery Center. Here's our juvies, a couple of weeks old. San Diego, because of the involvement of some pretty high-powered organizations, the rail is fairly well known, much more so than Orange County. Every time we release a rail to the wild, we put a USGS band on it and an anodized color band on the other leg. The color of that band denotes the year that the rail was released. That's me on the left. I'm much more handsome today than that. The guy on the right is Mike Mace. He runs many of the programs at Safari Park. And this is just one of the releases at one of the smaller marshes with small populations, trying to boost the numbers and the genetic makeup of some of these smaller populations was really what we were after here. Here's another release on the Seal Beach National Wildlife Refuge. We try to involve a number of the volunteers in these releases because they're fun. Here's a release at Kendall Frost with Campland in the background. And so, we don't want to be in the zoological breeding game forever and ever. I mean, the idea of all of this stuff is try to foster self-sustaining populations, but you can't do that unless you've got the habitat base that will accommodate them. The latest, one of the most important restoration efforts contemporarily is South San Diego Bay, hundreds of acres there, and it's coming along. We released 5 rails with satellite tags on them in 2016, and all of those birds stayed put, and some were still transmitting, one at least 2 years later, down next to the old salt works there. Sad news about rails is that as much effort as we've put in, it's a totally new ball game considering sea level rise. All of a sudden in the year 2016, the beautiful cordgrass forests that were pervasive in upper Newport Bay drowned on the shoulders of an El Nino that didn't give us much rain, did elsewhere, but not us. But what it did was pumped up a warm water bubble off the coast that came in with the tides, pushing them a foot more higher than what NOAA predicted them to be. And in that year alone, the cordgrass of upper Newport Bay, everything in the lower marsh drowned and all came floating to the edge of the bay. As a result of that, we used to have as many as 240 breeding pairs of light-footed rails in upper Newport Bay. And in 2020, the number was fewer than 100. My recollection, it was 70 breeding pairs, and they are in jeopardy. And I'm going to make this probably the parting shot because I'm running out of time. I'll just show you a couple of shots. Everything that you see in this photo that is now mud with algae associated used to be a cordgrass forest. On the far bank where those waterfowl are sitting, and you see those mud hummocks, that used to be covered in cordgrass so thick that it was difficult to walk through, and some of which came over my waistline. And I'm like 6.5 feet tall. I mean, that's, almost 7 feet tall. So that's pretty tall cordgrass. And today, cordgrass is attempting to come back, but it's little pioneer growth and it's not enough root. And those mud hummocks that took decades, if not centuries, to build under cordgrass roots are melting away. So we are slowly losing the elevation needed to ever be able to reestablish such cordgrass in that spot again. There's just another shot. Those are hummocks that were 40% more extensive and taller, and they are melting. Every time a tide comes in, it takes a little bit of that sediment back out and deposits on the mud fat, or takes it all the way out into the main channels. Upper left is Middle Island. That's the cordgrass that was there in about circa 2010. On the lower right is the same exact location. That PVC dowel in the bottom center is the same one you see in the center of the photograph in the upper left. And the outer cordgrass belt is just gone. Too much water, too long. Other issue facing upper Newport Bay that California Department of Fish and Wildlife is trying to get a handle on now is an overabundance of raccoons. Raccoons, when they're as abundant as they are at upper Newport Bay, leave calling cards where they can go out into the salt marsh and let their neighbors know that they're there, depending on the age of the scat that they leave behind. Raccoons are affecting the few spots left in upper Newport Bay that rails have to breed in. And I'm afraid that the upper Newport Bay light-footed rail population is very heavily leaning toward extirpation. This is just a slide to show you the ownerships and the acreages of the different wetlands. South San Diego Bay is really important, the largest, slightly over Magoo Lagoon. Tijuana is much larger than that. I think that's just Oneonta Lagoon, but still several hundred acres, so an important place. And I simply want to make the point here that it's not just the rails. The salt marsh is a very specialized, very extremely productive habitat that supports thousands and thousands of shorebirds of dozens of species, as well as a small number of resident birds who are in extremely big trouble because the habitat is disappearing. Another most visible and still quite abundant bird in upper Newport Bay is the state endangered belt Savannah Sparrow. And there's a baby Savannah Sparrow on a bad hair day. Now, that's actually what they look like when they're still losing their down. You see those big baby lips there, very indicative of a Savannah Sparrow. That cream-colored yellowish lore is the giveaway field mark for Savannah Sparrow. And with this shot taken by the late Lauren Hayes, I'm going to stop talking because I'm tired of listening to me. You certainly must be. And if there's a question or three, I may or may not answer it depending on difficulty.
I'm gonna go ahead and let everyone unmute themselves. So if anybody has a question, you can go ahead and unmute yourself and ask away.
Okay, if you're not asleep, raise your hand. Not a single picture. You know what they did? You've got to come up with a system here because they simply signed in and now they're off watching a movie, TV, or fooling around with something other than having to listen to me drone on and on and on. You get what you pay for. This class is only $35. Give me a break.
No, Dick, it was very interesting. I always find you interesting. This is Sylvia here. I'm a naturalist from way back.
Yeah.
I have a question though, because I'm very interested in Morro Bay, in case you can't tell. Where can I find salt marsh birdspeak in Morro Bay? Because I do some hiking there. I'd like to look for it.
You know, that's the one population that I have not visited, and I don't know if it's actually being actively managed. So I don't know Morro Bay all that well. I'm assuming they have a big friends group?
Yeah, I'm going to look into that. But I just wondered, because you mentioned that in one of your slides, and I thought maybe you knew.
Yeah, see, that was a change. That was a taxonomic thing. So it used to be that salt marsh birdspeak was just in the Southern California bight. And then I forget the guy's name, Farquhar or something like that. Or am I thinking of the donkey show? Anyway, some doctor, you know, re-described that particular genus and actually ascribed a new generic epithet or name to Birdspeak, and it will always be Cordylanthus to me, but that's not, you probably know the new genus. And in doing that, he broadened the characteristics for the salt marsh subspecies and included the Morro Bay population. And that's all I know. I've been to Morro Bay a number of times and looked at the marsh, and to me, the upper marsh habitat there is as beleaguered, if not more so, than anywhere else. The edges of the marsh were the easiest to fill and reclaim for, modern day urban purposes. And so most of our marshes have got this skinny little belt that comprises the upper marsh. And I think that's the case at Morro. I have not inquired as to the exact location or the stead of that population in a long while. So I can actually look into it and let you know what I find out. But what I was going to suggest, if you get a hold of the Friends group, there might be a location near a trail that they would tell you about. But let me see what I can find out, because I might be a little bit more connected than you.
Great, thank you very much.
Yeah.
So Richard, this is Alita Walther. Hi there. Richard, just how dire is the future for the clapper rail up in the upper Newport Harbor?
Alita, I could barely hear that.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yeah, it's a little better, yes.
Okay, I'll holler. So the question I have is just how dire is the situation for the clapper rails in upper Newport, or that area?
Well, we've gone from, I don't think I have a table with me. I wish I had the exact number. We've gone from 240 breeding pairs. It's the habitat, and it's the condition of the predator populations affecting that habitat, and maybe some other things I don't even know about. But we've gone from habitat that was able to support in excess of 200 breeding pairs to habitat that today supports maybe 50 and change. And so the habitat is in dire straits. And I'll tell you, it's not just Upper Newport Bay. I showcase Upper Newport Bay because of the travesty of the rail population and the plight of those birds. But I can take you to any one of our Southern California coastal wetlands and show you meadows that
Nadia,
are inches high.
can you get the last two waters and help Bilabai with the Actually call everybody for pizza first?
Was that English?
No, it wasn't me.
I did not understand that comeback.
Somebody's not on mute.
Apparently I'm being unresponsive. The rails are in big trouble. They're range wide, not just Newport. Anything else? All right, go back to your movies.
Thank you.
Well, so we did have a question come in from Cheryl Parsons, who says her dog won't stop barking, so she's typing her question out for us. Cheryl is from IRWD. She says, we've been using solarization to get rid of some of our invasives with mixed success, but we were recently informed by a consultant of ours that solarization should be done with clear tarp rather than black tarp. Have you heard anything about that? Have you tried clear tarp and found any differences between that and black tarp?
My guess is, because one uses clear tarp on a greenhouse, I would be amazed if you get the same effect with a clear tarp. If you've ever been backpacking, you know, if you want to stay in a camp for a couple of days, you hang a black container full of water, and very quickly it gets very hot. It's extremely easy to understand why a black tarp works. I don't for the life of me understand why a clear tarp would work similarly. Maybe it magnifies the heat rays, and that, you know, like the same effect as sitting in a car with the windows rolled up. That might be a possibility. I can tell you that black tarps work. The problem with a black tarp is you have to experiment with what it is you're trying to control and how long you leave it on. And there are some plants that, you know, there are some plants that basically will grow under incredibly adverse conditions that I'm sure solarization is not going to work for. But I'm not knowledgeable enough to really address that adequately. I'd, you know, put out black and clear tarps and do a little investigation is what I would guess. You just got to be careful when you use a technique like this. You'll know when you've been successful. You pick that tarp and there's nothing but etiolated plants and brown and blackened plants underneath. You know you're done. You can pick it up too soon, in other words. Anything else?
Sure.
I have a-
So hi, I'm Jamie, and I have a question about, like, has the lifestyle of the birds been affected by rising heat temperatures with each year that passes by?
Hi, Jamie. It's been a while. Okay, can you repeat the question? I'm not sure I understood. Sorry.
Sure, you can look in the chat. Hillary, can you say it for me, please?
Sure, yeah. The question is, has the lifestyle of the birds been affected by the rising heat temperatures with each year that passes by?
The the timing of breeding in birds is dictated by warming temperatures and length of day, and associated, because there's an associated burst in the growth of food. And so birds moving from one place to another, and where they will breed, and all of that is affected by temperatures. We are seeing, and we will continue to see over time, changes in the range of some species, and changing in the timing and other phenomenon in the life cycle of some species as a result in that, a result of that. You know, to be able to make a generalization across the board for the salt marsh inhabitants, the biggest effect on them has been too much water too long, and the salt marsh cover no longer has the stature it once had. I mean, it used to be that I could walk up anywhere and show you pickleweed that came up to my knees in the upper marsh of just about any salt marsh, and it's not there anymore. The dominant habitat is quickly becoming saltwort and annual pickleweed and mudflat and the like, and the cordgrass, and the pickleweed that's still there is a little diminutive meadow that's a couple inches high compared to places like with dampened tides that still have, pickleweed stands that are lush and, a foot, 2 feet high, as well as cordgrass that's over 1 meter tall. We still have a little bit of that above the old salt dike in Upper Newport Bay, but I have no idea how long that's going to last. Okay, you guys, pleasure to see the faces that were brave enough to share.
Thanks very much, Dick. It was a pleasure to hear you again.
Thank you, Richard. Good luck to you.
Nice to see you all. Good luck in your endeavors with Conservancy. Please hang in there, go forth and do good things.
You too.
Thank you.
All right.
Thank
Thanks,
you,
guys.
everyone.
Have a pleasant evening.
Yeah.